Hello there, welcome to HFY Quantum Pro. Here, helping one another makes the universe smarter. So, what we are waiting for? Let's begin our story.
The message arrived on a Tuesday that IT did not come as a missile or a warning shot. It came as a signal, clean and precise, transmitted on every frequency humanity used at once. It translated itself automatically into 231 languages. It was polite. That was almost the worst part. The Galactic Council of Sovereign Worlds hereby notifies the inhabitants of the third planet of the Sol system that Resolution 7 Omega has passed by unanimous vote. The planet, designated Earth, and all its resources are to be absorbed into Council stewardship. Resistance is not advised. A transition fleet will arrive within 72 hours. Cooperation will be rewarded. Dara Ose read it 3 times. She was sitting in a concrete briefing room in Abuja with 6 analysts, 2 cold cups of tea on the table, and a screen full of intercepted alien telemetry that her team had been quietly collecting for 11 months. She already knew the fleet was coming. She had tracked it for 3 weeks. She set the printed message down and looked at her team. "How long before they expect a response?" she asked. Nobody answered because nobody knew. That was fine. Dara had already decided Earth's response was not going to be words. Within the hour, the information was everywhere. Every government received the same signal at the same time. Some called emergency sessions. Some called for surrender. 2 small nations actually drafted formal letters of compliance before their own militaries talked them out of it. The United Nations convened a session that lasted 4 hours and ended with no agreement on anything except that they disagreed. Dara did not attend any of it. She was on a plane. The Council's fleet was enormous. Their early scans showed 31 capital ships, hundreds of support vessels, and enough troop carriers to land a ground force larger than most national armies. Their hull plating was rated to absorb anything in Earth's known arsenal. Their point defense systems could track and destroy incoming ballistic missiles at range. On paper, the math was simple and brutal. Dara did not work from paper. She spent the flight reading every report her team had built over 11 months. Alien communication patterns. Fleet formation AB. The way their command ships always stay back while their advanced forces push forward. The narrow window between a ground force landing and its first supply contact. She read, and she made notes, and by the time the plane landed, she had the shape of something in her head that was not a plan yet, but was becoming one that Sergeant Rook was waiting at the airfield. He was a large man with a broken nose that had healed badly and a habit of arriving places before he was asked. He handed her a coffee without being told and fell in a step beside her. "Bad?" he asked. "They think it will be easy," she said. Rook nodded slowly. "People who think it will be easy are my favorite kind." Across the planet, in the 72 hours that followed, things moved. Not loudly. There were no broadcasts of military mobilization, no dramatic speeches from world leaders, nothing that would show the alien fleet what was being prepared. Civilian broadcasts stayed normal. Some governments publicly discussed surrender terms as a distraction. The aliens watching from orbit saw what looked like a frightened, divided species trying to find a way to avoid the inevitable. What they did not see was the movement underground. Weapons relocated, supply lines buried, entire military units vanishing off the grid and reappearing in positions the fleet sensors had no reason to look at. Yuna, 26 years old and working from a converted server room in Seoul, cracked the first layer of the Council's sensor encryption in 19 hours. She did not celebrate. She printed what she found and got back to work that the Council fleet. War Speaker DOS reviewed his landing projections. The models predicted 70% surface compliance within 48 hours of first touchdown. The remaining resistance was expected to collapse within 2 weeks once the population understood that their weapons could not meaningfully damage Council forces. His senior aide asked if they should request updated surface scans given the unusual ground movement. DOS considered it. The movement was probably panic. Civilians relocating. Governments moving assets before the inevitable. "No," he said. "We proceed on schedule." On Earth, 71 hours into the countdown, Dara stood on a hillside in the dark and looked up at the sky. The fleet was visible now, if you knew where to look. Small bright points that moved wrong. Too steady, too deliberate to be stars. Rook stood beside her. "They voted on us," she said. "Sat in a room and voted. Like we were a plot of land being sold." "Yeah," Rook said. "They didn't ask anyone who'd ever fought us." Rook looked up at the lights in the sky. "That's their problem." The 72 hours ended. No surrender came. The Council fleet began its descent. The first Thurosai boots touched ground in 3 places at once. They chose open terrain. Flat land with clear sight lines, easy to secure, easy to defend. Their landing craft came down in tight formation, ramps dropping before the dust had settled, armored units moving out in the clean and practiced way of a force that had done this many times on many worlds. The streets nearby were empty. Doss noted that on his feed and filed it as expected. Civilian withdrawal was a normal response to a landing force. It meant the population was frightened, not organized. He marked it as a positive indicator that he was wrong, but he would not know that for another 4 minutes. The first unit moved into the edge of a market district in what had been a mid-sized coastal city. Stalls still had goods on them. Doors were open. Someone had left a radio playing. It felt abandoned in a hurry, which was exactly what it was supposed to feel like. The unit's lead trooper stepped on the pressure plate at the entrance to a narrow side street. What followed was not a large explosion. It was a precise one, the kind built by someone who understood exactly how wide an armor column was and exactly how much force it took to stop one cold in a confined space. The unit's advance element was gone in 2 seconds. The rear pulled back into a cross street and was immediately hit from 3 windows above by small arms fire that, while it could not pierce their armor, pinned them completely. Doss received the contact report and frowned at a second unit, 1 kilometer to the north, had reached what their maps showed as an open park. The park was now a flooded basin. Someone had diverted a drainage system in the past 12 hours. The ground looked solid. It was not. 3 vehicles were stuck before the unit stopped advancing, and by then the high ground around the basin had shooters on it. The third unit had the cleanest entry and made it 4 blocks before the buildings on either side simply fell on them. Not an explosion. Someone had spent 2 days cutting the structural supports on both sides of the street and rigged them to drop on a signal. Old buildings, heavy stone, and 3 Thurosai vehicles buried under rubble. Doss sent the reports up the chain. He did not use the word ambush. He wrote unexpected terrain complications. But his hands moved slightly faster than normal as he typed. Rook was 200 meters from the third collapse, flat on a rooftop, watching through a scope. He pressed his radio once. 3 for 3, he said quietly. Moved to secondary. His unit of 11 people were off the roof and into the tunnels in under 90 seconds. Above the clouds, the fleet was watching the surface feeds. Counselor Vreth, observing from the command ship, received Doss's updated report and leaned back in his chair. First contact friction, his aide said. Expected in primitive environments. The models account for it. Vreth said nothing. He was looking at the casualty numbers. Small numbers, yes. Trivial numbers compared to the force he had deployed. But they were numbers that were not supposed to exist at all. The models had predicted 0 combat losses in the first 6 hours. The models were wronged out on the ground. The landings continued. More units. More ground taken. The Thurosai were not losing. They were advancing, holding territory, establishing perimeters. But every perimeter cost something. Every block had a trick in it. A rigged door. A sniping position that was empty by the time the response force arrived. A water main turned into a weapon. Doss began to adjust his timelines. The 48-hour compliance estimate was quietly revised in his notes to 72. Then to 90-6. In orbit. Admiral Sohn launched Earth's first wave of space assets. Old satellites with their orbits adjusted. Rocket platforms that had been civilian launch vehicles a week ago. Drone clusters broadcasting false signals. The alien point defense destroyed them easily and thoroughly. It looked like a desperate, clumsy attack that IT was not. While the fleet systems were focused on the obvious threat, Yuna's team in Seoul was recording every single response frequency the Council ships used. Every targeting ping. Every communication burst. She was building a map of how they talked to each other. By the end of the first day, the Thurosai held ground. They also had losses they had not budgeted for. And somewhere in a tunnel under a city that looked defeated, Rook was eating a cold meal, perfectly relaxed, already thinking about tomorrow. "They're good," one of his soldiers said. "They're predictable," Rook said. "That's better for us." By the fifth day, Doss stopped calling them primitives in his reports that he did not make a decision to stop. He simply found that the word kept sticking in his throat because primitives did not do what these people were doing. Primitives panicked and broke and surrendered in groups. These people did none of that. They traded ground slowly, deliberately, always making the Thoros pay for every meter, then vanishing before the counter-response could land. He had taken 70% of 3 cities. What he held felt like standing in water up to his chest. He owned it, and it was still drowning him. Dara was running the resistance from a series of underground command rooms that moved every 36 hours. She coordinated through a network of small teams, each one knowing only its own piece. No central location, no single communication hub to destroy. She had built the command structure the same way you build a net, with no point that, if cut, would unravel the whole thing. The arguments with other national commanders were constant. A general from one country wanted to mass forces for a large counterattack. A commander from another wanted to go purely defensive and wait. Dara listened to all of it, agreed with none of it, and kept doing what was working. "You're asking everyone to trust a plan they can't fully see," one allied commander said over an encrypted line. "No," Dara said. "I'm asking everyone to do their part of a plan that doesn't need them to see all of it. There's a difference." Rook operated 70 kilometers behind the forward Thoros line. His team of 11 had become a team of 9 after the second week, and he did not talk about that. What he talked about, in his blunt and quiet way, was logistics. The Thoros supply lines were their most exposed element. Heavy vehicles, predictable routes, sensors that were excellent at detecting large movements and not calibrated for 2 people cutting a fuel line at 3 in the morning. His unit disrupted 4 supply convoys in 6 days without a direct engagement. The Thoros response was to increase convoy escort sizes, which meant pulling those troops off the front line, which thinned the advance. Rook noted this with satisfaction. Yuna had broken the second layer of council encryption on day 4. By day 7, she had something better. She had a full map of how the Thoros tactical network was structured, including the automated relay system the fleet used to push orders to ground units. She brought it to Dara on a tablet, said nothing, and watched Dara's expression change. "Can you write into it?" Dara asked. "I need 3 more days," Eunice said. "You have 2. In the council fleet, Vreth was having the conversation he had hoped never to have. 2 other council members had joined the command ship for observation. They were asking questions he did not have clean answers to. Why was the compliance timeline extending? Why were casualties above projection? Why was a pre-space flight world still fighting on day 7 when the models said day 3? Vreth ordered a full review of Earth's historical conflict data. The results came back in 6 hours. His lead analyst presented the findings with the expression of someone delivering bad news they had been dreading. Humanity had been in continuous recorded armed conflict for over 5,000 years. Not occasional wars, near continuous. They had invented, refined, and used against each other almost every method of warfare the review could categorize. They had developed tactics specifically designed to fight enemies who were better equipped. They had a documented history of losing early and winning late. Again and again, the analyst pointed out carefully that the Council's models had been built using data from 17 previous planetary absorptions. None of the 17 had species with anything close to this history. Vreth sat with that for a long time. Below, Dawes sent a message that he had not wanted to send. He requested permission to pause the advance, consolidate current positions, and reassess tactics before pushing further. Vreth denied it. The fleet's political standing within the Council depended on projecting confidence. A pause would look like struggle. He could not afford that. Dawes acknowledged the order. He stared at it for a moment, then went back to his maps. Rook was 300 meters from a Thoros forward position that night, watching a supply depot through a scope. Behind him, his team waited. "Why we even have this fight in us?" one of his soldiers whispered. Other planets apparently just gave up. Rook thought about it honestly, because giving up was never something we practiced. He lowered the scope. Move up. On day 11, something shifted. The Therosi fleet had been watching Earth's military assets carefully. They had cataloged everything. Ballistic missiles, fighter aircraft, naval vessels, the small and clumsy orbital platforms that had been destroyed in the first hours. Their threat assessment was built from public records, satellite imagery, and signals intelligence. They were confident they had a full picture. They did not. The weapons that emerged on day 11 had no reason to be in any galactic database. They were not advanced. They were not alien. They were human, which meant they had been built specifically to kill other humans who had been trying to do the same in return for a very long time. That was a different design requirement from anything the Council had planned around. The first surprise was the submarine launches. 6 vessels that had been sitting dark and silent on ocean floors since the invasion began, running on minimal power, invisible to the fleet's surface scans. They rose at the same moment and fired simultaneously. The targets were not ships. The targets were the 3 orbital relay stations the fleet had dropped in the first hours to coordinate ground operations. All 3 were hit. The Therosi ground network fractured into isolated segments that could no longer talk to each other in real time. DAW spent 40 minutes unable to reach 6 of his 12 forward units. The second surprise came from the air. Not fighters, which the fleet had already mapped and accounted for. Missiles. Specifically, missiles that had been designed to find and destroy mobile air defense systems in high-threat environments, flying at angles and profiles that the Therosi point defense was not configured for, because its configuration was based on what the Council expected Earth to have, not what Earth actually had. 4 Therosi ground support craft were destroyed before the fleet recalibrated. Vreth sat very still on the command ship and watched the reports come in. Admiral Sohn ran the third element from a command ship that was technically a converted research vessel and was absolutely not built to be anywhere near combat. She did not care. She had spent 30 years flying routes that most pilots refused because the margins were too tight and the risks were too high. She understood tight margins. She launched the second orbital wave. Again, not a serious attack. Again, an apparent repetition of the first clumsy effort. But Yuna had delivered on her 2-day deadline, and this time the wave came in broadcasting on Therosi command frequencies with false positioning data. 3 alien support vessels moved to cover coordinates that held nothing. 1 capital ship's point defense locked briefly onto a friendly unit before the error was caught. 6 seconds of confusion in the fleet's command chain. That was all. But in those 6 seconds, Sohn's real package arrived from a completely different vector. 3 modified long-range missiles that should not have been able to reach orbit. They had been modified. 2 missed. 1 didn't. The damage to the alien vessel was not catastrophic. A hull breach contained, but the ship had to withdraw for repairs. And the Council had just lost a capital ship to weapons that were not supposed to reach in the chamber on the command ship. One of the observing Council members said what everyone was thinking. They're not fighting like a world that expected to lose. Vreth did not respond. On the ground, Dara moved. The disruption to the Therosi network was the window she had been building toward. 8 coordinated pushes, all at once, all hitting the seams between ground units that could no longer communicate properly. Not enough to break the occupation. Enough to push back hard, to retake key positions, to remind every Therosi unit that this was not a pacified world. Rook's team came out of the tunnels in the dark and hit a forward command post that suddenly had no fleet support. It was a clean, brutal action, over in minutes. Rook did not celebrate. He redistributed the captured supplies, updated his maps, and disappeared back underground. Daw sent his second withdrawal request that night. Vreth denied it again. But he did something he had not done before. He opened a private channel to one other Council member, the one who had been quietly suggesting for days that some conversations might need to happen that nobody wanted to have publicly. He did not call it negotiation. He called it a strategic review of options. It was the same thing. The Council held an emergency session on day 17. It was not announced publicly. The official record described it as a routine operational review. Nobody believed that, But the fiction was maintained because the alternative required admitting what was actually happening. What was actually happening was that the invasion was failing, not collapsing, not routing. The Thorisai still held significant ground on Earth's surface. The fleet still owned orbit. On any objective military ledger, they were ahead. But they had been ahead on every ledger since Hour 1. And 15 days later, they were looking at a conflict that the models now projected lasting years. Years of casualties. Years of political exposure. Years of every watching civilization in the galaxy seeing a council fleet grinding against a world that refused to stop fighting. Vreth presented the operational review. His voice was steady. His political standing was not. 2 council members had already begun distancing themselves publicly from the invasion. A third had called for an independent review of Resolution 7, Omega's original legal basis. The structure was cracking from outside. On Earth, Dara launched the offensive she had been planning since day 1. That Yuna's access to the Thorisai command network had been growing carefully and quietly for 2 weeks. On day 17, at the same hour the council session began, she opened it fully. False orders moved across the Thorisai network. A reinforcement column was redirected into a dead valley. A supply convoy was rerouted through a zone that had been mined the night before. 2 reserve units received orders to hold position and held, while the front line they were supposed to support bent under pressure. Dara's coordinated push hit 16 points simultaneously. It was the most complex operation Earth had attempted, and it was not perfect. 4 of the 16 attacks stalled. 1 unit took heavy losses pulling back. But the other 12 worked, and the Thorisai line bent in ways it had not bent before. Doss managed his shrinking command with the controlled focus of a professional who understood he was in a losing position but had not been given permission to do what was necessary. He held. He adapted. He was very good at his job. Then Rook found him that IT was not planned as a capture. Rook's team had been targeting a mobile command post. They hit it clean and fast and found, inside it, a senior Thorisai officer who had stayed to finish transmitting a last report rather than run with his staff. Rook had the alien at the end of a hallway with nowhere to go and made a decision not to shoot someone who was not currently shooting at him. They sat across from each other in the wreckage. Rook gave Doss water, which the alien accepted with visible confusion. They did not share language. Doss had a translation unit on his belt. Rook pointed at it. Doss activated it. The conversation was short. Doss asked why humans fought the way they did. Not tactically. He meant the deeper thing, the thing that had no military explanation. Why did a species with no galactic allies, no advanced weapons, and no chance of winning on paper keep fighting as if losing had never occurred to them? Rook thought about it. He was not a complicated man, but he was an honest one. We've always been the underdog, he said. Against each other. Against everything. We never had anyone else to carry us. You either fight or you disappear, and we never disappeared. He paused. You came here expecting a different kind of people. That's not our problem. Doss said nothing for a while. Then, the council did not read your history carefully. No, Rook said. They read our weapons. Different thing. In the council session, the vote to suspend Resolution 7 Omega passed by a thin margin. Vreth voted against it. He was 3 hours later, formally removed from his position by a council procedural motion that his former allies introduced and supported. The fleet received the stand-down order. Doss, sitting in a captured room with a human soldier who was sharing a meal in the simplest possible act of normalcy, received it too. He read it once. Then he looked at Rook. It seems, he said carefully, that talks will begin. Rook nodded. Yeah, he said. Dara will handle that part. The negotiating room was on a neutral vessel. That was the council's request. Dara's response had been short. Fine, but the vessel parks in Earth orbit, not between Earth and the fleet. That distinction mattered. The council accepted it, and the fact that they accepted it told Dara more about their current position than any intelligence report had. She arrived alone. No uniform with decorations. A plain jacket and a folder with 3 printed pages in it. The council delegation was 9 people, formally dressed, carrying the careful expressions of people trying to project authority they were no longer sure they had. The lead negotiator, a Thoreau-side diplomat named something Dara's translator rendered as Council Speaker Veth, opened with a prepared statement about mutual interests and the benefits of cooperative integration and the Council's long history of peaceful transition management. Dara waited until he finished. Then she said, "We are not here for that. We are here to establish the terms of your withdrawal and to make certain this never happens again. If that is not what you came here to discuss, we can end the meeting now." Silence. Veth tried again with language about a joint framework. Dara interrupted him, which was not something delegates did to council speakers. Resolution 7 Omega approved the invasion of our planet. Your fleet came. You lost. That is the factual record. Whatever document comes out of this room will state that plainly, or there will be no document. One of the council members leaned toward Veth and spoke in a low voice. Dara's translator caught fragments. Political exposure. The watching civilizations. Precedent. She gave them 4 minutes to confer. Then she put her 3 pages on the table. The terms were not vengeful. They were precise. Full withdrawal of all forces within 30 days. Formal acknowledgement by the Council that Resolution 7 Omega constituted an unlawful act of aggression under the Council's own foundational treaties, a point Eunice's team had identified in Week 2 by reading the Council's own law more carefully than the Council apparently had. Reparations assessed at a level that would not cripple the Council, but would be felt, and a new designation for Earth, Protected Independent World, a category that had existed in Council law for centuries and had never once been applied to a pre-contact species. It would require a 2/3 supermajority to revoke, a threshold that was effectively permanent. Veth read the pages. He read them again. He looked up. The acknowledgement of unlawful aggression is politically impossible, he said. Then we're done, Dara said, and moved to stand. Wait. One of the other delegates, older, spoke directly for the first time. If the acknowledgement is included in a sealed annex, accessible only to member worlds upon request, rather than in the public declaration, Dara considered it. No sealed documents. But the public declaration does not need to use the word unlawful if the annex uses it clearly and the annex is formally registered with the Council archive as part of the agreement. The older delegate looked at Veth. Veth looked at his hands. They signed on day 23. The fleet began its withdrawal the following morning. It was visible from the surface if you went outside and looked up. Dara stood on a flat roof in a city that was partially rubble and watched the lights in the sky move in a direction they had not moved before. Away. Soane called from the converted research vessel she was still technically commanding. "We made them leave," she said. It sounded like she was still surprised. "We made them lose," Dara said. Leaving was just what came after. She went back inside. There were reconstruction assessments to review, 3 Allied commanders who needed debriefs, and a preliminary report on what Earth's new protected status actually meant in practice for future galactic contact. The work was enormous and immediate. Rook was somewhere in the field, she knew. He would find his way back when he was ready. Somewhere in the withdrawing fleet, Da stood at a viewport and watched the pale blue point of Earth shrink behind them. He thought about what Rook had said, about fighting as the only available alternative to disappearing. He thought about how the Council had read the weapons and missed the people, and how that gap between what you measure and what you face is where wars are actually lost. He wrote one line in his personal log before he closed it that we chose the wrong variable. Then the fleet crossed the threshold and Earth was gone from the viewport, and the stars looked the same as they always had, cold and numerous and entirely indifferent to what had just happened in one small corner of them. On Earth, somebody had to rebuild. They got to work.